The land Arthur Blackwood bought wasn't a home. It was a grave with a view. 160 acres of Montana failure, tucked into a valley where the wind came to die. The cabin sagged. The barn leaned. The windows were empty eyes staring at a life that had already ended. This suited Arthur just fine. He hadn't come here to build something. He had come here to bury what was left of his soul. 5 years ago, he'd had a wife, Martha. He'd had the promise of a son. A fever took them both on the same day, braiding their loss into a knot in his chest that never loosened. Then the doctor told him the final truth. The line ended with him. No more children, no more family. His name would turn to dust. So he sold the ranch he and Martha had built. He let the memories burn. And he washed up here, on this forgotten claim, a place as empty as he was. He worked from dawn till dusk, not to create, but to erase. He mended fences around nothing. He patched a roof he didn't care about. He ate hard tack standing up, the silence of the place a perfect match for the silence in his heart. He'd paid the last of his money for this plot of land. It felt less like a purchase and more like a surrender. For 2 weeks, this was his life. Work, exhaustion, nothingness. He barely looked at the property, just the cabin and the barn. He ignored the root cellar, its heavy doors swollen shut, half buried in dirt and weeds. He had nothing to store, nothing to preserve for a future he had no intention of seeing. But then, the cold came. It arrived overnight, a sudden, vicious snap that frosted the dead grass and turned his breath to smoke. The water in his bucket was a sheet of ice. This was the kind of cold that killed. A practical thought, the first in weeks, broke through his grief. The cellar. The earth below would be warmer than the air, a place to keep his meager supplies from freezing solid. He grabbed a pickaxe. He drove it into the hard-packed soil around the doors, the sharp crack echoing in the frozen air. The wood was waterlogged and heavy. It took him the better part of an hour, his muscles screaming, to pry one door open just enough to look down. A smell rolled out, damp earth, mildew, and something else, something living. He froze. His hand was still on the warped wood. He listened, his breath held tight in his chest. A rustle, a faint, terrified whimper, quickly shushed. It wasn't an animal. He knew the sounds of the wild. Coyotes, badgers, snakes. This was human. His first thought was vagrants, drifters, maybe a man on the run. His hand went to the Colt holstered at his hip. The cold steel was a familiar, deadly weight. "Whoever's down there, come on out," he called out, his voice a rough crackle from disuse. The only answer was a deeper silence, a silence so complete it felt like a held breath. He pulled the door open further. A weak shaft of gray daylight stabbed into the gloom. Steep earthen steps led down into blackness. He descended slowly, his gun raised, his boots sinking into the dirt floor. As his eyes adjusted, shapes began to resolve in the shadows. They were not vagrants. They were children. 3 of them, huddled in the farthest corner, wrapped in a threadbare collection of rags. The eldest, a girl no older than 14, was on her feet in an instant. She shoved 2 smaller children behind her, her body a frail but defiant shield. In her hand, she clutched a sharpened piece of a broken shovel handle. The rusty point was aimed directly at his heart. Her face was smudged with dirt, her eyes wide with a terror so fierce it was almost feral. Behind her, a boy of about 10 peered out, his expression not of fear, but of a solemn, unnerving watchfulness. And peeking from the blankets on the ground was the smallest one, a little girl with a tangle of pale hair and eyes that were 2 pools of pure fright. Arthur stopped. The Colt in his hand felt suddenly obscene, a heavy piece of iron that had no place here. He could feel their fear in the air, a palpable thing, as cold and sharp as the wind outside. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand and holstered the pistol. The girl with the spear didn't move. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. The words felt foreign in his mouth. She said nothing. Her knuckles were white. Her eyes darted from his face to his hands, then back again. Assessing. Waiting. "This is my property now," he stated, his tone flatter than he intended. It was a simple, hard fact. "What are you doing here?" It was the boy who answered. His voice was quiet but clear. "This was our home." Arthur looked around the dark, damp hole. This was no home. This was a place to hide. He thought of the derelict cabin, the collapsed barn. He remembered the 2 weathered wooden crosses in the overgrown plot behind the cabin. The names on them were faded, unreadable, Hale. He looked back at the children. He was standing in the middle of a story he did not understand, a complication he did not want. His solitude had been breached by 3 pairs of haunted eyes. He turned without another word and climbed the steps back into the biting wind. He left the cellar door ajar, a concession he couldn't explain, and walked back to the cabin. The silence he had built around himself was different now. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. That night, the blizzard came, a churning wall of white that swallowed the world. The wind howled like a grieving beast, driving snow into every crack and crevice of the old cabin. Arthur was trapped, and so were they. He knew they couldn't survive in that cellar. The thought was a burr under his skin, an irritation he couldn't ignore. For hours, he tried. He stoked his fire, stared into the flames, pretended they weren't there. But the image of the little girl's terrified face was seared into his mind. He saw Martha, her face pale against a pillow. He saw the empty cradle he had chopped into firewood. With a curse that was half prayer, half despair, he pulled on his coat, grabbed a lantern, and fought his way back through the storm. The wind nearly tore the cellar door from his hand. He lowered the lantern into the opening. "You can't stay down there," he yelled over the gale. "You'll freeze." He saw the older girl's silhouette, still defiant. He didn't have the energy for a fight. "I'm leaving the lantern. There's food on the table in the cabin. Come inside or don't. It's your choice." He trudged back, leaving their fate in their own hands. He half hoped they would remain, proud and stubborn in their hole. It would absolve him. But 20 minutes later, the cabin door creaked open. They slipped in one by one, silent as ghosts, bringing a gust of snow and the chill of the tomb with them. The eldest, Esther, still held her sharpened stick, though she kept it pointed at the floor. The boy, Caleb, carried the smallest, Ada, who was wrapped in the best of the blankets. They huddled together near the door, as far from him and the fire as they could get, their eyes tracking his every move. Arthur gestured with his head toward the table where he'd left a loaf of bread, a hunk of cheese, and 3 tins of peaches. He didn't speak. He turned his back on them, giving them the illusion of privacy, and stared into the fire, feeling their presence like a brand on his skin. He heard the scrape of the bench, the soft sound of bread being torn, the ravenous, near-silent way they ate. The storm raged outside, sealing the 4 of them in an unwilling bubble of warmth and mistrust. The blizzard lasted for 3 days. 3 days of forced proximity in the one-room cabin. The silence of the first night slowly gave way to a strained, fragile truce. Arthur moved about his routine, chopping wood for the fire, melting snow for water. The children watched him, their wariness a constant, silent judgment. He learned their names, not because they offered them, but because he heard Esther whisper them. Esther, Caleb, Ada. On the second day, he found Caleb staring intently at the broken hinge on the cabin's lone cupboard. The boy wasn't just looking. He was studying it, his brow furrowed in concentration. Without a word, Caleb picked up a piece of discarded baling wire. With a focus that seemed too old for his years, he began to patiently twist and bend it, fashioning a makeshift repair. Arthur watched him from the corner of his eye. A flicker of something, respect perhaps, stirred in his frozen heart. The boy had a mind for mending things. Ada, the youngest, was the first to breach the perimeter of their fear. She would watch him for long stretches, her thumb in her mouth. One afternoon, while he was cleaning his rifle, an act that made Esther tense visibly, Ada toddled over. She stopped a few feet away and simply pointed at the intricate carving of a running deer on the rifle's stock. "Horse," she whispered, her voice a tiny thread of sound. "Deer," Arthur corrected gruffly, not looking at her. "Deer," she repeated, satisfied. Then she turned and toddled back to the safety of her siblings. It was the first direct interaction, a crack in the ice. The story of their circumstances came out in painful, disjointed pieces, mostly from Esther. Her words were clipped, delivered with a reluctance that made it clear she was giving away secrets she had guarded with her life. Their parents, the Hales, had come west with dreams of wheat fields and a new start, but the land had taken more than it gave. Their father had died in a farming accident the summer before. A piece of machinery malfunctioned, she said. Their mother, broken-hearted and worn down, had succumbed to lung fever as the first snows of the last winter fell. "She told me to keep us together," Esther said one evening, her voice low and fierce as she stared at the fire. "She said they'd send us away to different places. She made me promise. So they had hidden. They survived on the last of the pantry stores, on Caleb's snares that sometimes caught a rabbit, on a grit and resilience that stunned Arthur. They hid from the sheriff when he'd come to post the foreclosure notice. They hid from the banker. They hid from everyone, their world shrinking to the confines of the decaying farm." Arthur listened, his own grief a silent counterpoint to her tale. He understood loss. He understood the desperate need to hold on. But his response had been to retreat from the world. Hers had been to build a fortress around her brother and sister. He felt a strange, unwelcome pang of shame. When the blizzard finally broke, the world outside was a pristine, blinding expanse of white. The excuse for their cohabitation was gone. An unspoken question hung in the air. What now? Arthur found himself unable to say the words, to tell them to leave. The thought of sending them out into that frozen wilderness, or worse, reporting them to the authorities, who would surely separate them, felt like a betrayal. He looked at Caleb, who was already trying to fix the latch on the wood box. He saw Ada asleep by the hearth, her small face peaceful for the first time. He saw Esther, her guard still up, but the exhaustion plain in the slump of her shoulders. "The well pump is likely frozen solid," he said, his voice loud in the quiet cabin. He directed the words at Caleb. "Think you can figure out how to thaw it without cracking the iron?" Caleb's head snapped up, his eyes bright with the challenge. A slow nod. Arthur then looked at Esther. "I saw tracks near the north fence line. Coyote, big one. You need to know how to handle a rifle, not just for hunting." Esther stared at him, her expression a mixture of suspicion and something else, something he couldn't name, but she didn't refuse. A new routine began to form, unspoken and fragile. It was not a family. Not yet. It was a partnership of necessity. Arthur taught Esther to shoot, her small frame surprisingly steady as she learned to aim and control her breathing. He taught Caleb about woodworking and mechanics, discovering the boy had a natural intuitive talent. And Ada simply began to attach herself to his orbit, following him as he did his chores, a quiet, tiny shadow. He found himself buying more food in the small, dusty town of Redemption, a place he usually avoided. He endured the curious stares of the general store owner, Mr. Harris, deflecting questions with one-word answers. He bought flour, beans, and a length of blue calico fabric, an impulse buy he justified by telling himself Ada's dress was more rags than cloth. One evening, he returned to find the scent of something other than wood smoke in the air. Esther, using the flour he'd bought, had baked biscuits on the hearthstone. They were a little burnt on the bottom and doughy in the middle, but as they sat around the table, A new, less tense silence between them. Arthur ate 3. He felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a dangerous feeling. It felt perilously like hope. This fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a horse and buggy one sun-drenched afternoon in early spring. The visitor was a man named Elias Donovan, a lay preacher and the self-appointed moral guardian of the county. He had a face that seemed permanently pinched in disapproval and a Bible he carried like a weapon. He had heard rumors in town. The reclusive Blackwood, who had bought the cursed Hale place, was buying supplies for more than one person. He had come to see for himself. He saw the children playing near the newly repaired porch, Ada laughing as Caleb pushed her on a crude swing he'd built. He saw Esther hanging laundry on a line, a boy's patched shirt, a small girl's dress. His eyes narrowed into slits of righteous certainty. "Mr. Blackwood," Donovan began, his voice oozing a condescending piety as Arthur stepped out of the barn. "I have come out of Christian concern. There are whispers in town. It seems you have squatters." "They're not squatters," Arthur said, his voice low and cold. He stood between Donovan and the children, a protective stance he didn't even realize he was taking. Donovan's gaze swept over the scene, missing the mended fences and the clean laundry, seeing only what he wanted to see: impropriety. "They are orphans of the county, sir. It is not right. It is not decent for them to be here alone with an unmarried man. It is a matter for the law. They belong in the state orphanage, where they can be properly cared for." Esther had herded the younger two behind her. Her face was a pale mask of old terror. The word orphanage was a death knell to her. It was the place where promises were broken. "They are cared for," Arthur said, his hands clenching into fists. "This is their home." "This is a place of ruin and sorrow," Donovan retorted, his voice rising. "And you are not their kin. You have no claim to them. I am reporting this to Sheriff Weston. He will see that order is restored. You can expect a visit from him." He turned his buggy around with a flourish and departed, leaving a cloud of dust and dread in his wake. The air, which moments before had been filled with Ada's laughter, was now thick with fear. Esther looked at Arthur, her eyes accusing, as if this were all his fault. "He'll take us away," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No," Arthur said, the word a raw vow. "He won't." But as he looked at their frightened faces, he wasn't sure it was a promise he could keep. The world he had tried so hard to shut out was now battering down his door, threatening to destroy the one thing that had made him feel alive again. The waiting was a quiet agony. For a week, every shadow on the horizon sent a fresh wave of anxiety through the cabin. Arthur worked with a grim fury, his movements sharp and angry. He found himself watching the children with a painful intensity, memorizing the way Caleb's face lit up when he solved a puzzle, the way Ada sang tuneless songs to a doll he had carved for her, the way Esther's face would soften just for a moment when she looked at her siblings. These small moments, which had begun to patch the holes in his own life, now felt like borrowed time. Esther grew more withdrawn, her old fierce defensiveness returning. She packed a small bundle of their meager belongings and hid it under her cot, a clear sign she was ready to run. Caleb became even quieter, his solemn gaze fixed on Arthur, as if trying to gauge whether this man was a rock to cling to or one that would crumble. One evening, as Arthur sat mending the new calico dress he had clumsily sewn for Ada, Esther finally spoke. "You should just let us go," she said, her back to him. "Before the sheriff comes, we can hide. We're good at hiding." Arthur stopped his work. "And where will you go, Esther? It's a hard country. You can't live in a root cellar forever." "We survived before," she shot back, whirling to face him, her eyes blazing. "We survived without you." "Yes, you did," Arthur said, his voice softer than he expected. "You did more than survive. You kept them safe. You kept your promise. but you don't have to do it alone anymore." Her defiant expression wavered, a hint of the terrified girl showing through the armor. "They'll take us apart. They'll send Caleb to a work farm and Ada to some family in the East. I won't let that happen." "I won't either," he said. The words came from a place so deep inside him he hadn't known it still existed. It was the place where his love for Martha was stored, a place of fierce, protective instinct. The inevitable arrived on a crisp autumn morning. 2 riders crested the hill. Sheriff Weston, a broad-shouldered man whose face was etched with the weariness of his job, and Elias Donovan, who rode beside him with an air of triumphant vindication. Arthur saw them coming. He told Esther to take the others inside and to keep the door shut. He walked out onto the porch and waited, his feet planted firmly on the wood Caleb had helped him replace. He felt strangely calm. The time for running was over. "Blackwood." Sheriff Weston greeted him with a nod, dismounting. "Donovan here has filed a formal complaint, says you're keeping the Hale children here against their interests." "Their interest is staying together, Sheriff," Arthur said, his voice even. "And staying in their home?" Donovan scoffed from his saddle. "This derelict place is no home. It is a den of impropriety. The man is not fit." Sheriff Weston ignored him, his eyes on Arthur. "The law is clear, son. Orphaned children become wards of the county. They're to be placed in the orphanage until a suitable family can be found. You're not family. You have no legal right." The cabin door creaked open. Esther stood there, with Caleb and Ada clinging to her skirt. Her face was pale, but her chin was high. She would not hide. The sheriff's gaze softened for a fraction of a second. He saw they were not starved or dirty. He saw the new dress on the little one, the mended shirt on the boy. He saw 3 children standing with the man, not behind him in fear. "This man is a stranger, a recluse," Donovan pressed, sensing the sheriff's hesitation. "What do we know of him? It is a risk we cannot afford." And at that moment, Arthur Blackwood, the man who had walled himself off with silence, began to speak. He didn't raise his voice. He simply let the truth of the last 5 years pour out of him. "I know about loss, Sheriff," he began, his eyes locked on Weston's. 5 years ago, I buried my wife, and I buried my son on the same day. He never took a breath." The confession hung in the air, raw and shocking. Donovan shifted uncomfortably. "After that," Arthur continued, his voice thick with emotion, "the doctor told me there would be no more children. For me, my line ended there. My name would die with me. So, I came here. I came here to be alone with that fact. I came here to work until I was too tired to remember what I'd lost. This place was meant to be an ending for me." He paused and gestured back toward the cabin, toward the children listening with wide eyes. "And then I found them, hiding in the dark, scared and alone, but together. And they interrupted my ending. They brought noise into the silence. This boy," he nodded at Caleb, "he can fix anything. This girl," he looked at Esther, "has more strength and honor than any 10 men I've ever met. And the little one, she just needed a safe place to be a child." He took a breath, the confession costing him dearly, but also setting him free. "You're right, Sheriff. I have no legal right. I'm not their kin. But I know what it is to be a family and to lose one. And I know that what these children have right here is the beginning of one. Don't take that away. Don't send them to a place with walls and numbers just to satisfy your rules. Their home is here, with me." A profound silence followed. Sheriff Weston looked from Arthur's earnest, pained face to the 3 children standing united on the porch. He saw Esther step forward. "We want to stay," she said, her voice clear and strong. He's good. He keeps us safe. He's teaching us. This is our home now." Weston looked at Donovan, whose face was a mask of thwarted righteousness. He then looked back at Arthur. He saw a man who wasn't trying to possess something, but to protect it. He saw a man who had been given a reason to live again. The sheriff sighed, a long, weary sound. Donovan, you filed your complaint, and I've investigated it. As far as I can see, these children are fed, they are clothed, and they are not in any immediate danger. In fact, they seem a damn sight better off than when they were hiding in a hole. He turned fully to Arthur. This is an irregular situation, Blackwood. Very irregular. There will have to be paperwork. I'll have to come by and check on things, but for now, I see no cause to remove them. Sheriff, this is an outrage, Donovan sputtered. No, Donovan, Weston said, his voice hardening. An outrage would be tearing apart the only family these children have left. My job is to protect them, and right now, it looks to me like the best way to do that is to leave them right where they are. He tipped his hat to Arthur. I'll be in touch. With that, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Donovan fuming. After a moment of sputtering indignation, the preacher yanked his horse around and followed, defeated. The threat was gone. That evening, a new kind of quiet settled over the cabin. It was not the silence of grief or mistrust. It was the quiet of peace, of a storm past. Arthur sat at the table, carefully sanding the edges of a small wooden horse he was making for Caleb. Esther moved about the room, preparing their meal, not with the tense efficiency of a sentinel, but with the calm grace of someone who belonged. Ada was asleep in her cot, clutching the calico doll, a small smile on her face. Later, after the children were asleep, Arthur stepped out onto the porch. The night sky was a vast sweep of glittering stars. He looked up at them and thought of Martha. For the first time, the memory did not bring the familiar, crushing weight of sorrow. It brought a gentle ache, a sad and sweet remembrance. He felt as if he were finally building something worthy of her memory, not just hiding among the ruins of their shared past. The farm was no longer just a place to end. It was a place to begin. The cabin door creaked open behind him. It was Ada, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. She padded over to him, not saying a word, and slipped her small hand into his large, calloused one. Her trust was absolute, a gift freely given. Arthur closed his hand around hers, the small fingers a fragile anchor in the vastness of the night. He looked out at the land, his land, and at the small, sturdy cabin that held his unlikely, precious family. The abandoned farm was no longer abandoned, and neither was he. But the peace was a lie, a temporary calm before a storm he never saw coming. What Arthur didn't know was that Elias Donovan was not a man who accepted defeat, and the story the children had told him about their parents. It wasn't the whole truth. Not even close. The real reason they were hiding in that cellar was far darker than simple poverty. And Donovan's interest in them had nothing to do with Christian charity. It had everything to do with greed, murder, and something buried deep beneath the soil of Arthur's new home. The sheriff's visit had bought them time, but it had also painted a target on their backs. The next morning, Arthur found something that made the hair on his arms stand up. A set of fresh tracks not far from the barn. A single rider who had watched the cabin from the ridgeline and then left. They weren't the sheriff's tracks. They were Donovan's. He was watching them, waiting. Inside the cabin, the children were different. The relief of the sheriff's decision had worn off, replaced by a deep, lingering fear. Esther watched the windows constantly. Caleb had taken to carrying a heavy wrench with him wherever he went. They knew Donovan wasn't done. A few days later, Caleb was helping Arthur shore up a weak spot in the cabin's foundation. As he pried away a rotting log, his hand hit something solid. Not rock, metal. He dug around it, his small fingers working quickly. It was a small iron box, rusted shut. He glanced at Arthur, who was hauling a new timber over. In a flash, Caleb shoved the box into a deep crevice in the foundation and covered it with dirt. He said nothing, but Arthur saw it. He saw the quick, furtive movement. He saw the look in Caleb's eye. A secret. He didn't press the boy. Trust was still a fragile thing between them. He would wait. That night, a storm rolled in, trapping them inside again. The wind rattled the windows, and in the flickering firelight, Arthur saw Esther and Caleb huddled together, whispering. Caleb was drawing something in the dirt on the floor with a stick, a map. He was showing her where he'd hidden the box. Their desperation was a palpable thing. Whatever was in that box, they believed it was their only hope, or their greatest fear. The next day, Arthur went into town for supplies. He needed to see Mr. Harris at the general store, but he also had another purpose. He went to the county records office. He told the clerk he was researching the history of his new property. He asked for the file on the Hale homestead. The clerk, a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses, handed him a thin folder. Inside was the foreclosure notice and the deed transfer to Arthur. But tucked in the back was something else. A death certificate for a Mrs. Annalise Hale, cause of death, lung fever, signed by a county coroner. But below that, in a space for a witness or attending physician, was a single, elegant signature. Elias Donovan. A preacher had signed the death certificate. That wasn't right. Arthur's blood ran cold. He thought back to what Esther had said. Lung fever. It sounded so simple, so tragic. Now it sounded like a lie, a convenient story to cover something else up. He pressed the clerk. What about her husband, Joseph Hale? The clerk shrugged. No record of him. Far as the county knows, he just vanished. Most folks figured he ran off, left his wife and kids to starve. That's why the bank foreclosed so quick. He didn't die in a farming accident. He vanished. Esther had lied. But why? Was she protecting her father's memory? Or was she hiding something far more dangerous? When Arthur returned to the farm, the air was heavy with unspoken words. He found Esther by the two graves. He stood beside her, looking at the weathered crosses. Esther, he said quietly, who are the Hales? She flinched. I told you. They were our parents. No, Arthur said, his voice gentle but firm. I mean, who were they? Your father. He didn't die here, did he? Tears welled in her eyes. The tough, protective armor she wore every day finally cracked. No, she whispered. He didn't. Before she could say more, Caleb came running from the cabin. The box, he panted. It's gone. They rushed to the foundation. The dirt was disturbed. The crevice where Caleb had hidden the iron box was empty. Someone had been there. Someone had watched them find it and waited until they were gone. And there was only one person it could be. Donovan. Panic set in. Esther was convinced Donovan would come for them now. That night she insisted they barricade the door. Arthur cleaned his rifle and his Colt, his face a grim mask. The quiet peace of their new life had been a mirage. They were living in a hunting ground, and they were the prey. For 2 days, they lived under siege, starting at every sound. On the 3rd day, a rider approached. It wasn't Donovan, it was Sheriff Weston. He dismounted, his face grave. Blackwood, I need to talk to you, and the children. Inside the cabin, he laid a rusted iron box on the table. It had been pried open. My deputy found this alongside the road to redemption. Looks like it fell off a buggy. My guess is Donovan's buggy. The box was empty. What was in it, Esther? The sheriff asked, his voice kind. Esther looked at Arthur, then at the sheriff. The time for lies was over. A deed, she said, her voice shaking, and a letter from our mother. What did the letter say? Weston pressed. Esther took a deep breath. It said that our father found something on this land, something valuable. He had a partner. Elias Donovan. It said Donovan got greedy. He killed our father for it. He buried him somewhere out on the prairie. The cabin was silent, save for the crackling fire. Our mother knew, Esther continued. She confronted him. He denied it, but she knew he was lying. He tried to scare her off the land. When she wouldn't leave, he locked her in the root cellar, to starve. He told everyone she had lung fever and was quarantined. By the time anyone found her, she was gone. But before he locked her in, she hid us. And she hid the box. The letter was her testimony. It was the only proof we had. Arthur finally understood. The feral terror in her eyes when he'd first found them. Their desperation. They weren't just hiding from the orphanage. They were hiding from their mother's murderer. Sheriff Weston looked grim. A letter is hearsay, Esther. It's not enough to convict a man like Donovan. He's respected. Without the deed, we can't even prove your family's claim to this land. As it stands, this is still your property, Blackwood, and Donovan knows it. Just then, Caleb, who had been silent the whole time, spoke up. The letter wasn't the only proof. Everyone turned to him. Ma gave me something else, he said. He walked to the fireplace, to the hearthstone he and Arthur had reset just a few weeks prior. He worked his small fingers into a crack between the stones and pulled one loose. From the hollow space behind it, he pulled out a small, leather-bound book. It was his father's journal. He handed it to the sheriff. Weston opened it. The pages were filled with his father's neat, careful script. He detailed his partnership with Donovan, their search for an old Spanish silver claim, and the discovery. Then the entries turned dark. He wrote of Donovan's changing demeanor, his greed, his threats. The last entry was short, the handwriting shaky. Donovan is coming. He says we must settle our accounts. I have a bad feeling. I told Annalise to hide the children if I do not return. God protect them. This was it, the proof. But before anyone could speak, the cabin door burst open. Elias Donovan stood there, his face no longer a mask of piety, but a snarl of pure hatred. In his hand, he held a pistol, and it was aimed directly at Caleb. That book belongs to me, Donovan hissed. It's over, Donovan, the sheriff said, his hand slowly moving toward his own gun. Put the weapon down. He stole my claim, Donovan screamed, his eyes wild. Joseph Hale was a thief. This land, the silver, it's all mine. I won't let a dead man's scribblings and a pack of filthy orphans take it from me. He lunged for the journal. Arthur moved faster. He shoved the table into Donovan's path, sending the man stumbling. The preacher's gun went off, the shot deafening in the small cabin, splintering the wood of the ceiling. Weston drew his pistol. Drop it, Elias! But Donovan wasn't listening. He scrambled back up, his eyes locked on the journal in the sheriff's hand. He saw his future, a rope and a gallows, and he became a cornered animal. He grabbed the closest person to him, pulling little Ada in front of him as a shield. Everyone stay back, he shrieked, pressing the gun to her head. Esther screamed. Arthur froze, his blood turning to ice. Let the girl go, Donovan, Weston said, his voice deadly calm, his own gun steady. Give me the journal and the deed, and let me ride out of here, Donovan bargained, his voice trembling with rage and fear. Or the girl dies first. Arthur looked at the terrified child in the arms of her mother's killer. He saw Esther, weaponless, tears streaming down her face. He saw Caleb, frozen in horror. He saw the sheriff, locked in a deadly stalemate, and he knew he was the only one who could end this. He thought of the rifle he had taught Esther to use. It was still on the wall rack, just a few feet away, but he could never reach it in time. His own Colt was holstered at his hip. A fast draw, but Donovan's gun was already on Ada. Too risky. Then he saw it, on the mantel, above the fireplace. An old, heavy iron poker. Slowly, Arthur raised his hands. All right, Donovan. You win. Just let the child go. He took a step to the side, away from the others, positioning himself closer to the fireplace. Sheriff, give him the book. Weston hesitated, his eyes locked on Arthur, trying to understand. Do it, Sheriff, Arthur said, his voice firm. Reluctantly, Weston tossed the journal onto the floor between them. Donovan kept the gun on Ada, but his eyes darted to the book. That was the moment Arthur needed. In one fluid motion, He lunged for the fireplace, grabbing the heavy poker. Donovan, distracted for a split second, turned his head. Arthur didn't hesitate. He threw the poker with all his strength, not at Donovan, but at the oil lantern hanging from a beam just above his head. The iron poker shattered the glass. Oil and flame rained down, splashing across Donovan's shoulders and the floor around him. He screamed, dropping Ada as he beat at the flames that instantly engulfed his coat. Ada scrambled away. Esther grabbed her, pulling her back. In that instant of chaos, Sheriff Weston fired. The shot was true. Donovan crumpled to the floor, the fire hissing out as his body fell into the pool of spilled oil. Silence descended, thick with the smell of gunpowder and smoke. It was over. The aftermath was a blur. The sheriff took their official statements. He gathered the evidence, the journal, the now empty box, Donovan's weapon. He arranged for the preacher's body to be taken away. He looked at the four of them, huddled together amidst the chaos of the cabin. "The journal confirms everything," Weston said, his voice weary. "It even describes where your father is buried. We'll find him. We'll give him a proper burial next to your mother." He looked at the deed, which had fallen out of the journal. "And this proves the land is yours. It never should have gone to the bank." He handed the deed to Esther. Her name, Caleb's and Ada's were on it, as beneficiaries. Their father had made sure of that. "What about him?" Esther asked, nodding toward Arthur, who was quietly sweeping up the broken glass from the lantern. The sheriff looked at Arthur, a long, appraising look. "The county was going to make these children wards of the state, but seeing as they are now landowners, they will require a legal guardian." He looked directly at Arthur. "Someone to manage their affairs until they come of age. Someone with a vested interest in their well-being. I can't think of a better man for the job, if you're willing." Arthur stopped sweeping. He looked at the three children. Their faces were smudged with soot and tears, but for the first time, the fear was gone from their eyes. They weren't looking at the sheriff. They were all looking at him, waiting for his answer. He thought of his empty life before they came, the silence, the grief. He thought of the grave he had come here to tend. He looked at the small, sturdy cabin that had become a home. He looked at the unlikely, precious family that had given him a reason to live again. "I'm willing," Arthur said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer name. The abandoned farm was no longer abandoned. The line he thought had ended had found a new, unexpected beginning. He hadn't just bought a piece of land. He had inherited a future, a promise to keep, a family to protect. And for the first time in 5 long years, Arthur Blackwood felt the unyielding knot in his chest finally, blessedly, begin to loosen. If you believe that sometimes the greatest treasures are the people we find when we're lost, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button for more stories that remind us it's never too late for a second chance.